Morning, everyone. Just to get started, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am currently sitting on, that I think everyone else is sitting on, which is Wadawurrung land, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So today we start really getting into the nuts and bolts of, I guess, why the foundation exists. So starting to talk about the need that exists in our community and how the foundation uses not just our philanthropic funds to address those needs, but also, as Bill talked briefly about yesterday, about how we use not just our connections in the community, but how we also use our standing and, 65 years of trusted stewardship in the community to work with other organisations and partners to, catalyse that positive change. So I won't steal Kerry's thunder, because then she will get very upset at me. So I will let Kerry go into it. Just to let you all know, we are recording again. So if you want to turn off your microphones, but again, use the chat at any time. If we don't get through the chat during the session, sorry, I'm eating coconut. I shouldn't be. We will get back to those questions at the end of the session, or I'll answer them afterwards. And we will have a break at about the halfway mark. So there'll be time to go and refill the coffee cups and do anything that you need to do for a few minutes. So Kerry, I shall pass on to you.
Thank you, Sheridan, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm going to share some slides just to break up the Zoom grid a little bit so that you can stare at a slightly different screen. And just to give you a sense of what I'm going to be focusing on today, I'll just try and bring this up. You'll have to excuse me, sometimes the technology around presentations. There we go, hopefully that works. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? I'm going to take that as a yes because I can't see everyone's image at the moment. But basically what I'm going to talk about today is really to give you a sense of some of the challenges, or I guess issues that we see in the community, and talk about a little bit more about the Give Where You Live theory of change. Have a look at some of the data that we look at with regards to the key focus areas, and then just give you a bit more of an overview of what it is that Give Where You Live does, start to unpack a little bit our theory of change and how we are attempting to support community. And then later in the week, I'll actually go into a little bit more detail around some of those key elements of what it is that Give Where You Live does. So today is a bit of a painting, a bit of a picture around what we see in the community and how we're trying to broadly help. The first part of it, I apologise in advance, it is a bit data heavy, and whilst I'm providing probably more information than you necessarily need, really just wanting to give you a sense of some of the key information, key sort of research and key data that sits behind Give Where You Live's work. When you go to develop your own presentations, by all means you can take what is relevant or what resonates to you. So there may be one sort of piece of information or piece of data that we provide today that really resonates for you, or you think really resonates with the staff with you in your organisation. So don't feel that you have to understand all of this in absolute detail. And some of it does get quite complex as well. So I'll try and keep it simple, although Sheridan probably laugh at that because I'm not good at simple sometimes. So I will do my best. The other thing that I just want to flag before we dive into this a little bit further is the added complexity of the current context in which we are all operating right now. So what I've tried to do in looking at some of these key areas in our community is give you a sense of what was the situation prior to COVID-19 and getting a sense of what are some of the challenges that we were trying to address, but then giving you a sense of what we're seeing now. And now some of the stuff that we're seeing now is a bit more anecdotal, and we don't have necessarily really a robust data around it because, as I'm sure you can appreciate, we're in the middle of a crisis, and trying to get that level of data can be quite challenging. So I think just to give you a sense of how the current COVID situation is actually playing out in this context as well is really useful and important. So firstly, I'm just going to start talking about the focus areas that Give Where You Live focuses on. Those being education, employment and life crisis, which Bill touched on a little bit yesterday. These are the key areas that Give Where You Live has felt that we are better placed to be able to focus our support and also focus our funding into. And there's a number of kind of reasons and evidence that sits behind this. So education, there is really, really strong Australian research, but also global research around the links between a good education and school completion, and then positive outcomes in life. And those outcomes can contribute towards, you know, more positive health outcomes, obviously more positive employment outcomes, housing stability. So the connection between education and so many other indicators is really, really strong. So being able to emphasise and support specifically in the education space, we see as a potentially life-changing opportunity for members of our community. With employment, again, a relatively obvious one, that the relationship between unemployment and levels of poverty and financial stress, absolutely intrinsically connected. What is useful to understand within the employment space is that it is also about the quality jobs. And I think Bill touched on this a little bit yesterday. And by quality jobs, what we're talking about is a living wage, opportunities for training and career progression, and having a job that offers more than just casual and insecure hours. So needing to have some consistency so that individuals can actually manage their situation. It's those kind of key elements around employment that are really critical and are required to be able to shift someone out of financial stress or out of disadvantage. And life crisis, again, a relatively sort of obvious one. We need to be able to support individuals, family members, when they're experiencing any level of crisis. So that could be through the provision of food relief, housing, shelter, or even access to healthcare. We obviously want to support early intervention and prevention activities. So really trying to support community partners that can actually help prevent people hitting that crisis point. But we also acknowledge that sometimes that we're unable to prevent that, and that we need to be able to support people when they are actually experiencing levels of crisis. Oops. I didn't mean to do a phased in there. So, so just to give you a sense of some of the data and information that we see around education in our community, in our region. So in some areas in our region, more than half of all children are entering school, so entering primary school, already developmentally vulnerable. Now, this is based on the Australian Early Development Census, which is done every sort of 3 to 4 years, and it measures developmental vulnerability on a number of domains. So it looks at physical, social, emotional, language and communication developmental outcomes for children. So in some areas in our region, we have more than half of the children already entering school developmentally vulnerable. The Geelong project is also reporting that between 200 and 250 school-aged adolescents have already sought help for homelessness issues in the Geelong area. Now, this was based on data back in 2018, but it again gives you a sense of the level of complexities and challenges that youth might actually be experiencing, which then has an impact on their ability to gain an education. Now, the census data, whilst we look at that and go, well, that was 2016, it's still an incredibly robust data set, and it's still absolutely relevant when we're actually looking at key issues in the community. So back in 2016 in that census, whilst in the G21 region, our youth engagement figures were actually quite strong. So 8.9% of youth within the G21 region were reported as being disengaged, either from employment or education, which was actually slightly better than the state, which was around 10.6%. However, again, we actually see that in some areas within our region, that youth disengagement rate could be as high as 43%. So you start to see some real disparities around our region doing relatively well across the board. However, there are some regions and some suburbs within our community that are not having that same opportunity or experiencing much more significant challenges and issues. Another key measure that we look at is around year 12 completion. And I would say it's year 12 or an equivalent of. We do acknowledge that, you know, necessarily finishing year 12 and going into university is just one pathway and not necessarily the pathway for everyone. However, what we do see again in some areas within our community is some really significant differences in year 12 completion rates. So for the Greater Geelong region, again, relatively strong figures of 77% of people aged between 20 and 24 had completed year 12. However, you know, for one of our suburbs, that year 12 completion rate was as low as 46%. So you get to see some real disparities across our region. And it really helps you to sort of understand that there are some bigger challenges and issues that people are experiencing to be able to actually get that level of education and support that they necessarily need. Now, all of this data is pre-COVID. So just to give you a sense of some of the things that we're seeing right now. We're seeing, understandably, some even greater challenges when it comes to home learning and anecdotal evidence of even greater disengagement of youth within our region. We have youth who are just challenged purely by lack of technology or access to computers or laptops, lack of access to the internet, or just low levels of data. That means that they are really struggling to be able to engage with home learning activities, which are primarily online. A useful statistic that relates both to education and employment from the census was in, again, some suburbs, up to 34% of households didn't have access to the internet. So if you put that in this context, you've got potentially 34% of households in some suburbs just unable to be able to work from home or unable to be able to do home learning. Now, the state government has recognised that and has actually, and the local schools are putting a lot of effort into making sure that everyone has access to technology and the internet. However, we also know that that can be really problematic, and sometimes, you know, you've got families at home that are trying to juggle some really complex situations right now, who might be competing over the use of technology, who are also trying to share limited access to data to be able to actually do everything that is now expected of them by online platforms. What we're also seeing in the current situation is some really concerning issues around youth mental health. And again, the state government has thankfully started to respond in that respect and has been putting and investing significant funding both into Headspace and more recently putting funding directly into schools to be able to assist in identifying high students that may be at risk of mental health issues. However, how this plays out in the long term, we still are really unsure and unclear. We are still continuing to fund a number of key community partners in this space, in the education space. But those partner organisations and the projects and services that they're trying to deliver are also challenged by the school closures. So even when schools were back on site, rightly so, schools were making decisions about restricting external parties being allowed to actually go into the school grounds. So the ability for some of these community partners and projects to continue to deliver and support some of these students has also been significantly impacted. A lot of them have managed to shift online, but again, there's just a lot of complexity and challenges in how you do that. And for those youth that are particularly vulnerable, sitting on a computer and trying to gain support via a Zoom, as we can probably all personally appreciate, is just not necessarily going to provide the same level of support that they would have got if it was face-to-face. So there's a lot of additional challenges that, again, we're seeing in the current context. Employment. So again, generally our region actually reports really, really strong employment rates. So I think it was even just earlier this year, Geelong, well, the G21's unemployment rate was as low as 4.4%. So really, really strong numbers. However, even in reporting those regional figures, we had some suburbs that had unemployment rates as high as 15%. And if we go back to the census data, which allows us to drill down into much smaller kind of pockets within suburbs, we had unemployment rates within some areas as high as 23%. And youth unemployment as high as 75% in some of these smaller areas within our community. Now, barriers to employment can be vast and also can be very, very complex. The image that I have there on the screen, which hopefully you can see okay, was some mapping that we did with local employment services to get a really good idea of what are some of the barriers, but also what are some of the enablers for people being able to get employment. So some of the barriers that people might experience could be, you know, a lack of access to transport to be able to even get to a job or to get to an interview. Lack of childcare assistance if they're a single mum. The ability to actually purchase work clothing. The skills or ability or capacity to be able to develop a CV, write a cover letter, or sell yourself and argue that you're the best person for the job. And then there's some other things as well around, I always sit there and look back at how I got my first job. Now, firstly, my mum pushed me out the door to go and get a job when I was 16, but we also knew through our friends and families that Kmart was recruiting some additional checkout chicks at the time, and we and we signed up and we put our name down. Now, if you're in an environment where you don't have necessarily a strong network or support network to be able to support you in getting a job, but also finding out and accessing where there are job opportunities, it can actually have a really significant impact on your ability to just even know that jobs are available. The other thing that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at employment is this question around unstable and casualised work. So more and more what we're seeing is highly insecure and unpredictable employment. And this is also then paired with some fairly significant stagnant wage growth that we're seeing in certain industries. And when you tie that in together, you're actually seeing really high levels of underemployment and financial stress. So underemployment is basically when people are not getting enough hours or enough pay to be able to actually survive. And so they're still trying to balance between, new start payments and employment. We've had, particularly through the GROW initiative, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, seen increasing accounts of businesses employing people on 0 hour contracts, which basically means they're not guaranteeing you any hours any week, which makes it really, really challenging. It means you're in a very unstable employed environment. And constantly having to then re-register back with New Start and have delays in payments and so forth. So this unstable kind of casualised employment is actually a really significant issue. And I think in the current context, again, what we're seeing is that it's those casualised employees that have just lost all employment and been unable to get JobKeeper payments and so forth in the current context. So that it exacerbates, I guess, some of the existing challenges that we had been seeing anyway. So what are we seeing now? It's actually really hard to get good data around employment at the moment, and I was trying to find the latest unemployment figure, and it's the latest one, which was reported a few weeks ago, was actually that Geelong's unemployment rate had gone down to 3.3% in the current environment. Now, I think for most of you, you'd be going, that doesn't make sense. And you're right, it doesn't make sense. There is a lot of stuff that happens and sits behind unemployment rates, which means at the moment it's actually quite a problematic measure. Now, some of the things that they do is, so JobKeeper is not included in that, which is kind of okay, but it kind of hides the potential impact. But what they also do is they smooth it and average it over a year as well. So if we've had some really positive points in the economy over the last year, then that's actually going to sway necessarily what's happening now. So what I've done is I've pulled out a couple of other tables for you. As I said, this is where we start getting into really sort of data heavy stuff. So for those who like data, I'm happy to share links to be able to access this data source a little bit more if you want it. But what I think is particularly obvious, if we compare June last year to June this year, we've had an increase in the number of the proportion of our population registering for JobSeeker. So this in June last year, we had 4.7% of our population registered for JobSeeker. In June 2020, we have 9.7% of people registered for JobSeeker. So there's quite a significant jump. And the other detailed data heavy table that I'll quickly show you is JobKeeper. Now, JobKeeper is actually a really, positive, strong policy response to what was going on. But what it also does is that you need to actually consider some of the numbers that are currently sitting under JobKeeper to get a really much better understanding of what the impact of COVID-19 is on employment at the moment. So with that in mind, what we've actually seen for just the Geelong region is a decrease in the number of jobs available by 11.8%. That's actually quite a significant shift. Now, unsurprisingly, the sectors most impacted are accommodation and food services and retail trade. So food services includes hospitality and wholesale food distribution as well. So if we were to just specifically look at accommodation and food services, we'd actually see that around 4,500 jobs have been lost just in the Geelong region since March. So it's quite a significant impact. Now, half of those are currently covered by JobKeeper, which is great. But there is obviously a number of really critical questions that it then raises over the next few months and the next year. Is that basically what is the ability and capacity of those businesses to be able to restart and rebuild when they have the ability to reopen their doors? Because that's going to be the critical point that we see whether they can actually continue to maintain the employment of those people who are on JobKeeper payments. So what does that actually mean for unemployment in our region? We're still really unsure about. But for us, the additional question is, what does that mean for someone who had already been experiencing barriers and challenges to getting a job? They are now competing with a much wider pool of people who are looking for employment. Yet they are even more vulnerable. And again, some of the funding that we potentially are seeing is going to focus on getting those recently unemployed people back into jobs. Absolutely needed and absolutely critical, but hopefully not at the expense of also supporting people who are already experiencing challenges prior to the COVID-19. That was the really data heavy bit. So if you got through that, then hopefully you'll be okay for the rest. And life crisis. Now there is a number of different data sets that we could look at. So I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but I'll just focus on a couple of key ones. So prior to COVID-19, there were approximately 2,000 meals prepared every day in the Geelong region for people needing food relief. Of that, 63% of the people who were presenting for food relief were single parent families. And in some suburbs, there were up to 21% of households were already experiencing rental stress. So basically, their income was insufficient enough to be able to cover their rental costs plus other living costs of utilities and food. So we were already seeing an increase in some suburbs of rental stress in the last census. And what we've also seen is, so the Sexual Assault and Family Violence Centre has seen reports of increases each year for the last 3 years of reports of domestic violence. And last year they had on average about 269 referrals into their services every month. And what are we seeing now? So this is where we start to see that the data is actually really quite challenging to get right now, just because we're right in the middle of the crisis, and the impacts on some of these services are really, really shifting quite quickly. But what we have seen, so Foodbank has recently reported that an estimated increase of 78% of people seeking food relief. Now, we also know with the work that we do with the local Geelong Food Assistance Network that across the board in our region, we're seeing some fairly significant increases in demand for food relief. We are seeing also that there are some members of our community who are actually not eligible for any government assistance right now. Most notably are international students and asylum seekers. So a lot of the government packages and a lot of the benefits that are available in this current situation, there are restrictions around certain visas. Now, at the end of the day, these people are living in our community and contributing to our community, and we have some massive, massive concerns around their ability to actually access anything right now. And we're seeing, particularly with international students, a really massive spike in them seeking food relief assistance from the local food assistance network. There's also been really significant increases in the need for assistance to defer rental and utility bills. The challenge that you have there is that all it is doing is deferring payment, it's not waiving it. So people are now potentially building up higher levels of debt that at some point they are still going to need to resolve and address. And what we've also seen is the current lockdowns that we've seen have actually worsened the potential for abuse in many homes. So there's been recent reports that 60% of domestic violence services are reporting an increase in the frequency of violence against women. So some fairly significant, fairly stark data that is starting to come through. I'll also just note with regards to the food relief sector that there are some additional challenges that we've seen in the current context. So the food relief sector is really heavily reliant on volunteers to be able to support and provide the service. A large portion of those volunteers were older members of the community who are also considered at risk of COVID-19. So rightly so, a lot of those volunteers are not able to or not comfortable to be able to volunteer in the current context. They've also seen a massive drop in the people donating food into food relief sectors. Again, completely understandable. When we first went into lockdown in April, everyone was a little bit worried and concerned about what that meant for their own families and their own households. And so there was just a really massive drop in people donating food into food relief centres, and one that happened really, really quickly and really sharply as well. So a lot of the food relief centres are having to find other ways to be able to access food to then be able to provide to their clients. One of those is just more of purchasing food from the local supermarket and from other wholesalers. But then you also then have the challenge of people have been panic buying toilet paper. So there was a period there where the Geelong Food Relief Centre just had no access to toilet paper, which, you know, if people are accessing their service, they need that just as much as the rest of us. So at the same time, we have an increased demand in the food relief sector. We are experiencing some really massive challenges in how that sector manages to deliver its services to community. And they're doing an amazing job despite all those challenges. So that was very data heavy and I do apologise for that. So I'm going to let you have a tea break now. I just wanted to get you to reflect on something whilst you're grabbing a cup of tea or a coffee or just getting up to stretch your legs. I think in this current context, every single one of us have levels of stress and uncertainty of what does this mean? What does this mean for my job? What does this mean for my partner's job? What does this mean for my family and my friends? What does this mean for my child's education? So excluding the very specific health concerns that people have around this global pandemic, it's some of those flow-on effects that we're actually seeing in the crisis around the impact it has on employment, the impact it is having on education, and the impact it might be having on where we get our next meal. And I think it's useful to just take a moment and think, this current crisis actually gives us a really small insight into what some members of our community experience every single day. Now, this is pre-COVID. And if you then overlay the current crisis on top of a situation where someone may have already been financially stressed, was uncertain of where they were going to get their next meal, and was really concerned about their child's education, but just did not know how to support or give them additional information or tools or resources to be able to complete their education. You can understand some of the complexities that some people in our community are experiencing right now. And so for me, the really significant question we have is, yes, we need to be able to respond and support this greater need and demand in our community, and we need to make sure that everyone is supported through the current crisis. But we also need to make sure that we don't lose sight of those that are most vulnerable in our community, and we need to make sure that we are putting extra effort and emphasis on supporting them as well. So on that rather heavy, somber question, unless Sheridan, you wanted to say anything?
No, I think we're all about done on that.
Sorry.
We all know that you love a good stat. So I think that was actually all really, really interesting. And although we're joking saying it is quite data heavy, it is really important that you kind of have an understanding of what we're really dealing with here. So, you know, they are heavy stats, and they're frightening stats, and they're stats that, you know, we aren't all aware of. So on that note, it's nearly 20 to 11. Why don't we have a quick 5-minute break, do what you need to do, and then why don't we meet back in at about 1:45, and we'll start a quick conversation around what we are trying to do to start addressing this need.
The next piece of the presentation, I swear, is a lot easier than the last piece of the presentation. And I will start just kind of talking high level around the Give Where You Live theory of change, which I believe you have or will have access to that document. Is that correct, Sheridan? Yes, good. Because I don't think you can see it very well on the slide, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
but I just want
to. All of the slides we'll put on the Trello board that we'll get out either this afternoon or in the morning. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will just say with the presentation, I have lots of notes in there. So I'll just keep them in there because I refer to other bits of data and information that might be useful to you. So, you know, use what you will. I just wanted to, I guess, check in after that first session and see if anyone had any questions or any reflections or thoughts on the data heavy piece of the presentation. Anything?
No, some of it was a bit surprising and others not so much. You're already pretty well aware, if you've been in Geelong for a while, of the suburbs that are under a bit more pressure and, you know, lower socioeconomic. So yeah. Some of it's not surprising in terms of you can already see those trends when you kind of just out and about and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also the bit like it is obviously extremely difficult to get reliable data for what's happening at the moment, but I mean, we can make some pretty safe assumptions around that impact is definitely going to be felt more by those communities, which just sort of for me, I guess it drives home the importance of I guess the organisation and also the role that we have this year in trying to get as much funding as we can.
Absolutely. Anyone else? Look, if what I will say, if you have any questions at any point around the data, or if you're looking for something particular or would like some additional resources specifically around data, let me know. Happy to share that, and we can maybe put some links and some additional information on the Trello site as well. But I concede that I don't want to necessarily bombard you with lots of information. So I will just again quickly share my screen. Oops, we're going to that one. And hopefully I can move along. Can everyone see that? Cool. Okay. So only just a couple of slides, and really just to give you a sense of where Give Where You Live is kind of focusing our efforts, and where we think Give Where You Live can play a role in the community. So Bill touched on this a little bit yesterday. So I'm just going to kind of bring in the elements of the theory of change, just so that you, and talk through that a little bit, so that you can kind of see how this, I guess, framework kind of informs how we do what we do. So Bill touched on this yesterday a little bit, and like, we absolutely acknowledge and recognise the significant importance of the grants, and particularly in how that then supports community partner organisations to deliver really critical projects and services in the community. However, we also acknowledge that in addition to funding community organisations through grants, we need to do additional work. Some of the problems and issues that we see in the community are not shifting or changing, and sometimes, in some instances, circumstances are potentially getting worse. Now, a lot of the challenges that we see are absolutely driven by broader social and economic drivers. So when we talk about systemic change, we're talking about how do we shift some of these bigger challenges and issues and drivers that are actually causing the problems, and contributing to some of the challenges that people in our community might be experiencing. So we also recognise that there's not going to be one single solution to some of these challenges. They're quite complex issues that require a lot of collective work. We need to work with other organisations. We need to work with local businesses, local government, to be able to actually adjust and shift some of these bigger issues and challenges. And we just acknowledge that we need to do something different. I think Bill said it yesterday, that if you keep doing what you keep doing, you're just going to keep seeing the same result. So we acknowledged a few years ago that whilst we absolutely see the critical importance to continue to fund some of those critical services in community, well, we also acknowledge that we potentially need to do other work, and potentially need to look at doing other things to try and actually shift and change some of these bigger challenges that we're seeing. So this is the Give Where You Live theory of change, which you have access to. Now, a theory of change is really simply how we believe we can create change in community. So there's a lot of kind of language and sort of almost academic kind of elements to a theory of change, but really what you need to understand is this is how we think Give Where You Live can create and support positive change in the community, and this is where we believe we can play a really strong role to support that. So absolutely, first up is around investing in and supporting local community organisations and projects and services to be able to deliver those critical services for community. And we do, in that instance, is where we really focus around supporting projects for education, employment and life crisis. So those focus areas kind of run through all of our theory of change, but do very specifically inform who we fund and the projects and organisations that we support. In addition to the funding, we do also provide some additional support to community partners, and this can really vary, and it could be something as simple as introducing two organisations that we believe would be valuable for them to align and work better together or more closely together to support their clients. Introducing organisations so that they can refer clients across who might need some additional support that is provided by someone else. And over the last couple of years, we've also focused a bit more effort around providing sort of training and capacity building to organisations as well. So we have previously run a theory of change training for organisations so that they can also understand how they are best placed to support needs in the community and assist their clients. And we are planning on doing more, but again, the current context kind of poses some challenges around running online training and that kind of stuff. So that is absolutely something that we are still keen to do, and really just trying to support and assist our community partners any way that we can, so that it's not just about the funding. In addition to the community partners that we fund, we also develop, fund and support other key initiatives that we actually think can catalyse some of that broader change that we were talking about and that Bill mentioned yesterday. So in a lot of cases, these are larger initiatives. In pretty much every single instance, they are about bringing together a collective of organisations to work collaboratively on a critical issue or challenge. I will talk a little bit more about some examples of those initiatives later in the week, and Bill sort of touched on some of those yesterday as well. But, you know, just some examples of, we have the G21 Region Opportunities for Work initiative, the GROW initiative, which works with over 150 local businesses. We also do a significant amount of work and support in the food relief sector as well, and obviously quite critical at this point in time to continue to support that network and the service providers. Underpinning particularly some of those broader initiatives, but also everything that we do, some of the, I would consider them almost principles of how we think change can occur, and that's by playing this role in connecting and convening organisations and businesses and members of community to be able to actually focus on key issues and try and actually understand them and create change, positive change, and try to address some of the issues and barriers that people might experience. Where we can, we also are keen to share knowledge and evidence of what works. And some of that goes to the capacity building work, but also it's just about sharing across the community partners and services where there are resources, research and evidence that can actually support the delivery of projects in our region. We obviously raise money to fund and support work in our community. But we also, through our public engagement work, we are also really trying to raise awareness of some of the issues that are impacting our community and seeking to influence public opinion to increase understanding, but also to garner some support for what is needed in our community to actually shift and change things for everyone. And we also look at leveraging additional funding where we can. So we actually do talk to other foundations, both locally and more broadly, other foundations and donors and state government, to try and actually get funding and support for work in our local community as well. So where we can, we are advocating for additional resources for the G21 region. So I'm going to, on Friday I think it is, talk in a little bit more detail about some of those elements. I will give a bit more sort of tangible examples of the grants that we provide, And over the next couple of weeks, you'll also get to meet some of our community partner organisations as well, and hear directly from them about the work that they do and the services and support that they provide into community. And then I'm also going to talk in a little bit more detail around some of those other initiatives that Give Where You Live supports in various different ways. So I will leave that conversation until later in the week rather than dive into that now. So that is the end of the formal presentation. I might just stop sharing the screen at this point. But if you have any questions or any sort of comments that you want to make at this point, and as I said, we'll have opportunities in other sessions to talk about it a bit further. So if you think of a question later, you can also bring it up at some point. But yes, any sort of questions that anyone has from, I guess, that kind of brief overview of what Give Where You Live does.
I guess, does it make sense to you? Is it kind of what you thought what we did? You know, is it along that sort of lines? All good? Everyone must be fine.
Yeah.
All right. If you do think of anything, again, feel free to email us. As I said, today we just wanted to sort of set a little bit of that foundation, the foundation work, and get that cemented into your minds before we head on Friday into, you know, some of the nuts and bolts and how we really do things, who we work with. So I think Friday will be quite interesting. Thursday we've got our first session, lunchtime session. So I think that will be really interesting. So if anyone hasn't got anything else, we're right on time at 11 o'clock. Or we're 3 minutes over, so that's because Bill didn't talk, so that's good. He always makes us go over time. So we will let everyone get on with their days. Again, if you think of anything throughout the day, feel free to drop the team a line. We'll be in contact over the next day also, and we will see you later in the week.